All right, let's jump into another deep dive. This time, research methods. You sent over some sources, and they look like they're straight out of a social sciences textbook.
Yeah.
I gotta say, though, this whole ex post facto research thing really jumped out at me. Seems kind of like, a time travel movie or something.
It is. It's definitely a unique approach.
Yeah.
Essentially what it means is you're looking back in time, trying to understand what caused something that's already happened. It's kind of like, those puzzles where you already know what the picture's going to be,
Yeah.
but you're trying to figure out where all the pieces fit.
Oh, okay. That's a great way to put it. So basically, we've got all these academic sources talking about different ways we gather information and then use that to make conclusions, right?
Yeah.
From what I'm seeing, we're going to be covering surveys, this whole mysterious ex post facto research,
Right.
and then something called field experiments.
Yeah, that sounds like...
What do you say we start with something a little more familiar, like surveys?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I mean, most of us have probably taken a survey at some point.
Right.
But it's really interesting to think about, like, the strategy behind how they're designed.
Yeah.
And why they're such a popular tool for research.
Absolutely. So I guess, in a nutshell,
Yeah.
these sources are described in surveys as this way to gather data from a group of people and then use that to learn about a much larger population.
Yeah.
So, for example, let's say you wanted to understand, the music preferences of every teenager in the entire country.
Okay.
I mean, you can't survey every teenager. That just wouldn't be realistic, right?
Right.
So instead, you would pick a smaller group very carefully, get their insights, and then use that to kind of represent that whole teen population.
Exactly. It's all about, efficiency and representation.
Right.
Researchers, they spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to choose the right group of people to survey so that the results actually do reflect that larger group.
Makes sense. But I'm seeing here that there's actually different types of surveys, too.
Yeah.
There's something called cross-sectional and longitudinal surveys.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing those have something to do with time, right?
You got it. A cross-sectional survey is like a snapshot in time.
Okay.
It's capturing data from different groups, but all at that one point.
Gotcha.
Think about it like you're taking a poll right now to see how people are feeling about, I don't know, a current event or something.
Right.
It gives you a glimpse into people's opinions just at that moment.
Okay, so it's like a slice of how things are right now. What about these longitudinal surveys, though? Are those more like a time-lapse video or something?
That's a great way to think about it. Yeah. Longitudinal surveys follow the same group of people over time.
Oh, okay.
And they're looking at how their thoughts or their behaviors or really whatever is being measured, how that might change over time. So imagine you're following the career paths of a group of college graduates for 10 years. That would be a longitudinal study.
Oh, that's fascinating. You could really track trends and see how their life experiences kind of shaped where they ended up.
Exactly.
But I'm imagining it's got to be tough, keeping track of those same people for that long, right?
Oh, absolutely.
What if people move away or just don't want to participate anymore?
Yeah, that's a really common problem with longitudinal studies. It's called attrition.
Okay.
And researchers, they have to be super mindful of it.
Yeah.
Because if certain types of people are more likely to drop out of the study, it can really mess with the results.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's say you're studying exercise habits.
Okay.
And the people who hate exercising are the ones who are dropping out.
Yeah.
Well, your study is going to make it seem like everyone loves to exercise.
Exactly. Attrition can create this bias in the data.
Right.
So researchers are always trying to use different strategies to try to minimize that impact.
Well, that was way more in-depth on surveys than I thought we were going to get. I mean, there's clearly a lot more to them than just asking a bunch of random questions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Now, are you ready to step back in time and tackle this whole ex post facto research thing?
Let's do it. I mean, it definitely calls for some detective work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What really stood out to me was, with ex post facto research, you're starting with the outcome, right? It's already happened. You can't go back and change the past. So you're basically working backwards to try to figure out what things might have led up to that outcome.
Right.
It's kind of like trying to understand why a certain species went extinct. You can't rewind time, so you're looking at, fossils, environmental records, historical data, trying to put it all together and build this hypothesis.
That's a great way to put it. And it highlights one of the biggest challenges with this type of research.
Yeah.
It's all about trying to make these conclusions when you can't control the variables.
Exactly. It's not like you can run a controlled experiment and like manipulate things to see what happens. You're stuck with whatever happened in the past.
Right.
But wouldn't that make it super hard to be sure about cause and effect?
It definitely adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah.
One of the big things researchers have to watch out for is this thing called the post hoc fallacy.
Okay.
It's this really tempting trap,
Yeah.
You start assuming that just because two things happen around the same time, one must have caused the other.
Oh, yeah. I've totally fallen for that kind of thinking before, for sure. Like when I was a kid, I was convinced that if I wore my lucky socks, my favorite team would win.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's no connection there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in research, you got to avoid that kind of faulty logic.
Right.
The sources actually give this example related to delinquency in parenthood.
Okay.
Just because a higher percentage of, delinquent individuals are also parents doesn't automatically mean that one caused the other.
Right.
There could be a ton of other factors at play, like socioeconomic conditions or, childhood experiences.
Right, right. So it's kind of like saying, like, all musicians have hands, but having hands doesn't automatically make you a musician.
Precisely. Correlation does not equal causation.
Right.
So researchers doing this ex post facto research, they got to be super careful about not jumping to conclusions just based on, like, surface level connections.
So it sounds like ex post facto research, you need a good dose of skepticism and a willingness to kind of consider a bunch of different explanations.
Absolutely.
You really got to dig deep to try to make sense of the evidence.
It's all about weighing the evidence, considering all those possible alternative explanations, and just acknowledging that there are limitations when you're trying to draw conclusions from past events.
This has been fascinating, this whole ex post facto thing. I'm starting to see the appeal of being a research detective, even if it means dealing with some pretty tricky logic puzzles.
It's definitely an intriguing approach.
Now, for our final act in this episode, what do you say we explore the world of experiments?
Let's jump into it.
All right. So the sources you sent over, they were specifically focusing on field experiments.
Right.
Which, just to remind everyone, those are experiments that happen out in the real world, not in a controlled lab setting.
Exactly. Like you're conducting a study, out in a busy city park instead of in some, like, sterile lab.
Right. Exactly. So I'm thinking field experiments, they must give you a more realistic view of how things actually work.
They do, but
I bet it's a lot harder to control all those different things that could be affecting the results, right?
You've hit on one of the key trade-offs that researchers have to think about when they're deciding between lab experiments and field experiments. It's all about finding the right balance between control and realism.
So, like, lab experiments are all about control, right?
Right.
You're trying to isolate specific variables, but it might not actually reflect how things work out in the real world.
Exactly.
But then field experiments, you're embracing all that messiness, which makes it more realistic.
Right.
But then you lose some of that control. It's a tough choice.
It is. It's a classic dilemma.
Yeah.
The sources actually use this great example to illustrate this point. It's talking about studying different teaching methods on fifth-grade students.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It was about comparing, like, a more hands-on tutorial approach versus, like, the traditional lecture format.
Exactly.
Now, I'm imagining trying to control for every single variable in a classroom full of fifth graders is...
It's a challenge.
Well, yeah, to say the least.
It definitely presents its own unique set of challenges.
Right.
You got all these different personalities, learning styles, the classroom dynamic itself. Even things like, what time of day it is or what the weather's like outside, all that could influence the outcome.
It's like trying to run a scientific experiment in the middle of a playground.
Exactly.
So, I mean, if you're doing a field experiment, how do you even begin to isolate the effects of, like, that specific teaching method you're looking at when there's so much other stuff going on?
Well, that's where careful planning and, like, strategic data collection and some pretty sophisticated statistical analysis all come in.
Right.
It's not about eliminating all those other variables. I mean, that's practically impossible in a real-world setting.
Right.
It's more about acknowledging that they might have some influence and using those statistical techniques to figure out whether the teaching method itself is actually having a real impact on how the kids are learning.
So it's kind of like, I don't know, trying to spot a particular bird in a flock.
Yeah.
You need a good eye and, like, the right tools to pick it out from all the others.
That's a great analogy. Field experimenters, they have to be super observant.
Yeah.
Really adaptable, and just good at separating that signal from the noise.
Well, our exploration of field experiments has been really enlightening.
Yeah.
It's clear that studying human behavior out in the real world is a complex thing, but it's got to be super rewarding.
It is. It definitely offers a unique perspective.
And I'm sure it provides insights that you might not get in a more controlled environment.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking of unique perspectives, the next research method on our list is one that I've always found super interesting. Case studies.
Oh, yeah. Case studies are fascinating. They offer this way to really dive deep into specific individuals or groups or even events, and they can be incredibly illuminating.
Yeah, it's like taking a magnifying glass to a particular phenomenon and really trying to understand all the intricacies.
Exactly. And the sources actually highlight this really interesting case study in an educational setting. It involves this teacher, and she's trying to figure out why these 3 specific students are struggling in math.
Oh, yeah. I remember that.
It's a great example of how case studies can be used to go beyond, the simple explanations.
Yeah.
And really delve into how complex the situation can actually be.
So instead of just saying, like, oh, these kids are just bad at math.
Right, exactly.
Or they're not trying hard enough. This teacher's taken a more, investigative approach.
Yeah.
It's almost like trying to solve a mystery.
Exactly. The teacher takes on the role of, like, a detective.
Right.
Gathering all this detailed information about each student, like their background, their learning styles, their previous academic experiences, even their home environment.
It's about recognizing that there's always more to the story than what you see on the surface, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I bet that kind of deep dive can be super helpful in figuring out how to best support those students.
Oh, for sure.
Because if you understand the specific challenges and circumstances each student's facing, then you can tailor your instruction and give them more targeted support.
Exactly. It's a much more effective approach than just assuming that one-size-fits-all solution is going to work for everybody.
Right. That's a really powerful example. It shows how, case studies can be used not just for research, but for like practical, real-world problem solving.
Absolutely.
It's about using research to actually make a difference. Now, speaking of making a difference, the sources actually go into a lot of detail about different types of case studies.
Yeah.
There's illustrative, exploratory, cumulative, and critical instance case studies. And it sounds like they each have their own like special purpose.
They do. Each type of case study kind of offers a unique lens for examining a phenomenon.
All right, so give me a crash course in case studies. What are the main differences between these 4 types?
Okay, well, let's start with illustrative case studies.
Okay.
I mean, the name kind of gives it away. They're all about using a specific case to kind of paint a vivid picture of a particular concept or phenomenon or situation.
Okay.
So imagine you're reading a case study about, I don't know, a company that successfully implemented this new leadership training program.
Okay.
It's showcasing a real-world example that brings the concept to life.
So you're taking this abstract idea and making it more concrete and relatable?
Exactly. Illustrative case studies, they're often used to, make those complex ideas more accessible or to show how theories play out in practice.
Gotcha. So that's illustrative. What about exploratory case studies?
Okay. Well, exploratory case studies.
Are those more about, like, venturing into uncharted territory?
That's a great way to think about it. Yeah.
Okay.
They're often used, like, in those early stages of research when you're still trying to wrap your head around what's going on.
Right.
It's like dipping your toes in the water before you jump in head first.
So you might use an exploratory case study to, like, get a feel for the key factors.
Right. Involved in something, come up with some potential research questions, or even generate hypotheses that you could then test more rigorously using different methods.
That's exactly it. It's about gathering all this rich, detailed information to really gain a deeper understanding of the phenomenon before you commit to a much larger scale study.
All right, so illustrative and exploratory check. What about cumulative case studies?
Okay. Cumulative case studies.
I'm guessing those involve, like, accumulating something.
You got it. They're all about gathering insights from multiple cases.
Oh, okay.
So you can build a more comprehensive understanding of a phenomenon.
Gotcha.
So imagine you're interested in studying, like, the factors that contribute to successful community gardens.
Okay.
You might collect case studies from, different gardens across the country.
Right.
Each one with its own unique approach and challenges.
So you're not just looking at one isolated example.
Right.
You're looking for patterns across multiple cases.
Okay. To see what works, what doesn't, and why.
Yeah, cumulative case studies allow you to, identify trends and develop these more robust theories because you're drawn on a wider range of experiences.
That's incredibly valuable. Now, for our final type, critical instance case studies.
Okay.
I'm getting a sense that these are a bit more, critical.
You could say that. They're often used to challenge those existing assumptions or to test the limits of a theory.
Right.
Or even just to examine these unique situations that might not be generalizable to a wider population.
Sure. You're basically using a specific case to kind of shed light on a broader issue or to question conventional wisdom.
Exactly.
Like instead of focusing on the average outcome, you might focus on an outlier, a case that goes against expectations, and see what lessons can be learned from that.
That's a great way to put it. They can be really thought-provoking,
right?
Even if they don't offer these easily generalizable findings. They can help us, refine our theories, identify those potential blind spots, and kind of push the boundaries of our understanding.
I'm really seeing how versatile case studies can be.
Yeah.
They're not just about describing what happened in a certain instance.
Right.
They're about using those instances as a springboard for deeper analysis, critical thinking, and like we saw with that teacher example, real-world problem solving.
They're a powerful tool for both research and practice.
Now, speaking of tools, these sources actually dive into the steps involved in conducting a case study. And it's way more systematic than I originally imagined.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a real process to gather in, analyze, and interpret in all this rich qualitative data.
Absolutely.
I'm ready to unpack those steps if you are.
Let's do it. Let's dive into the world of case study methodology.
Okay.
So the first step, and this is outlined in the source, UNIT-4.pdf, is determining the present status of the case you're going to be studying. This is about getting a clear understanding of the current situation, much like a doctor, taking a patient's vital signs before they make a diagnosis.
So it's like establishing a baseline, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Getting a snapshot of where things are at right now before you try to figure out how they got there.
Exactly. And this initial assessment, it often involves, direct observation, collecting data through surveys or interviews, and reviewing any relevant records or documentation.
Okay.
It's about building that solid foundation of knowledge before you dig deeper.
So you've got a clear picture of the present. What's next? Do you hop in a time machine and go back to the past?
Well, not literally.
Right.
But the next step does involve looking back in time.
Okay.
Trying to identify those most probable antecedents.
Antecedents. So those are
the events or factors that might have contributed to that current situation.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So it's like a detective searching for clues to understand what led to a crime.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah. So you're piecing together the backstory, trying to identify potential causal factors.
Exactly.
I'm imagining that involves, interviewing people, reviewing records, maybe even doing some historical research.
Absolutely. And it's often an iterative process, As you gather more information, you might have to revise those initial hypotheses that you had about what led to the current situation.
Okay.
It's all about being open to new insights as the case unfolds.
So you've got your initial hypotheses based on your investigation into the past.
Yeah.
What happens next? Do you put those hypotheses to the test?
Absolutely. The third step is all about verifying those potential antecedents.
Okay.
This is where you really dig deep, using a multi-method approach to gather more evidence and see if those initial hunches actually hold up.
So you're testing your theories against the evidence.
Exactly.
And if the evidence doesn't support your initial ideas, that's a sign you need to revise your thinking.
Exactly. Case study research, it's often a very dynamic process of, hypothesis generation, data collection, analysis, and refinement. You might start with one set of assumptions.
Right.
But as you gather more data, you might have to adjust course.
That makes a lot of sense. It sounds like case study research, you really got to be flexible and open to the unexpected.
Absolutely. It's all part of the journey.
You've gathered enough evidence to back up your hypotheses.
Right.
What's the next step?
Well, once you have a solid understanding of the factors that have shaped the case, you can move on to that fourth step, diagnosis and potential remedial measures.
So that's where you start thinking about how to apply your insights to actually improve the situation.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond just describing the situation
Right.
to actually recommending strategies for improvement. Think about it like a doctor. They've diagnosed the illness, and now they're recommending a course of treatment.
And I bet those recommendations are way more effective.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're tailored to the specific circumstances of the case.
Absolutely. By understanding the unique challenges and opportunities that are presented by the case, you can develop these really targeted solutions that are more likely to make a real difference.
That's what I love about research. It's not just about, gathering knowledge for the sake of it.
Right.
It's about using that knowledge to solve problems and make the world a better place.
Now, speaking of making the world a better place, I'm realizing we've covered a ton of ground in this episode.
I know, right?
We've gone through surveys, we've ventured into the past with ex post facto research, explored the complexities of field experiments, and delved into this rich world of case studies.
I feel like I just got a crash course in research methods.
You've definitely grasped the key concepts.
And I think you've highlighted a really crucial point, too. Research is this powerful tool
for understanding the world around us, but it's only as good as our ability to actually apply it, right?
Well said.
All right, everyone. That's it for part 1 of our deep dive into research methods. We'll be back next time to continue our exploration.
Looking forward to it.
We'll uncover more fascinating insights and practical applications then.
See you then.
Welcome back to our research methods deep dive. I'm still thinking about all the stuff we talked about in the first part. Who knew there was so much to learn about how we learn?
It is fascinating, isn't it? We often just take for granted all the work that goes into generating reliable knowledge.
Yeah.
But each of these research methods is like a carefully crafted approach to understanding the world around us.
Totally. We left off talking about case studies.
Right.
And I got to say, that example with the teacher really drove home how valuable those can be in the real world. It's not just research for the sake of research. It's about using that knowledge to make things better.
Absolutely. Case studies let researchers really dive deep into these complex situations, uncovering nuances and coming up with hypotheses that you might not see in these bigger studies.
Yeah. Before we move on from case studies, though, I'm curious how they're actually done, These sources make it seem like there's a pretty systematic process.
There is. I mean, case study research, it might involve this, in-depth qualitative exploration.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it's not rigorous. There's a real structure to how you gather the data, how you analyze it, how you interpret it to make sure that the findings are valid and reliable.
So let's walk through those steps.
Okay.
What's the first thing a researcher needs to do when they're embarking on a case study?
The first step, and this is outlined in the source, UNIT-4.pdf, is determining the present status of the case.
Okay.
So it's basically like getting a clear understanding of the current situation.
Gotcha.
Much like a detective arrives at a crime scene and starts taking in all the details.
So you're gathering as much info as you can about, the current state of affairs?
Exactly.
The who, what, where, when, why of the case?
Precisely. And this often involves, direct observation, collecting data through surveys or interviews, and reviewing any relevant documents or records.
Okay.
It's all about building a good, solid foundation of knowledge before you really dig in.
So you've got your picture of the present.
Right.
Now what? Do you try to rewind time to figure out how things got to this point?
Kind of, yeah. The next step is trying to identify what they call the most probable antecedents.
Okay, antecedents. So those are
the events or factors that might have contributed to the current situation.
Oh, okay.
It's like, the detective searching for clues to figure out what led to the crime.
Right. So you're basically piecing together the backstory, trying to identify those potential causal factors.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because as you start gathering more information, you might start seeing patterns emerge, or connections you didn't even think about before.
Yeah.
It's like putting together a puzzle.
Right.
Where each piece of evidence helps you build a clearer picture.
So let's say you have your initial hypotheses about what caused this situation based on looking at the past. What's next? Do you put those hypotheses to the test?
Absolutely. The third step is all about verifying those potential antecedents.
Okay.
This is where the researcher really gets to dig deep, using multiple methods to gather more evidence and see if their hunches actually hold up.
So you're not just taking those hypotheses at face value. You're actively trying to find evidence to, like, prove or disprove them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You got to be willing to challenge your own assumptions.
Right.
And this might involve, more observations, in-depth interviews, reviewing more records, even like giving assessments or tests.
Right.
It really depends on the case.
Okay. So you're basically gathering more data to see if it lines up with your initial ideas.
Right.
What if it doesn't, though?
That's a great question. And that's a really important part of case study research. It's often this iterative process,
Right.
If the evidence doesn't back up your initial hypotheses, that means you got to go back, revise your thinking, and explore other explanations.
Okay.
It's all about being flexible and open to new insights.
So research isn't always about proving what you already think.
Right.
It's about letting the evidence guide you, even if it takes you in a different direction.
Now, assume you've gathered enough evidence to support those hypotheses. What's next?
Well, once you have a solid understanding of the things that shape the case, what do you do then?
You can move on to that fourth step, diagnosis and potential remedial measures.
So that's where you actually start thinking about solutions.
Exactly. It's going from understanding the problem to finding ways to make it better.
And that's where the real-world value of case studies comes in, right? Because by understanding the specific challenges and opportunities in that case, you can develop strategies for intervention or improvement.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's all about turning that research into action.
I love that idea. Research as, like, a tool for positive change. Now, speaking of positive change, the sources actually get into some of the misunderstandings about case studies.
Okay.
And I gotta admit, I used to think that they were, like, less rigorous than other methods, like experiments.
I can see why you might think that case studies often deal with these, like, complex, messy, real-world situations. And you don't always get these nice, neat conclusions.
Right.
But that doesn't mean they're not valid or valuable as a research method.
All right, so let's clear up some of those misunderstandings.
Yeah.
What are some of the, I guess, myths about case studies that the source talks about?
One of the biggest ones is that case studies can't be generalized.
Okay.
Because they only focus on a single instance. Because you're not looking at this big, randomly selected sample. People argue that the findings don't really apply to a wider group.
So the concern is, because you're looking at just one specific case.
Yeah.
The insights might be too narrow or too unique to that situation.
Exactly. But, as the source points out, generalizability isn't always the goal.
Right.
Sometimes the power of a case study is that it can really show the complexity of that one specific situation, even if those insights aren't statistically representative of a whole population.
So it's about recognizing that different research methods have different purposes.
Exactly.
Case studies might not be the best for making broad generalizations.
Right.
But they can be super helpful for understanding the details of specific cases.
Exactly. And that nuanced understanding can often be more valuable than just a general overview. It's like the difference between, reading a travel brochure about a country versus actually going there.
Right, and experience it.
And living in the culture.
That's a great analogy. Okay, so myth number 1, case studies aren't generalizable. Busted. What's another one?
Another one is that case studies are only good for coming up with hypotheses.
Okay.
But not for testing them.
So people think they're more exploratory than conclusive.
Exactly. But like we talked about, case studies can be used for both.
Right.
The process of identifying and verifying those antecedents, that involves gathering evidence to either support or refute the hypotheses.
Right. So it's not just about coming up with ideas. It's about actually testing them against the data.
Precisely.
So myth number 2. Case studies are only for generating hypotheses. Also busted.
Busted. Now that we've addressed those misconceptions about case studies, let's go back to the world of experiments.
All right.
Remember we were talking about the trade-offs between doing experiments in a controlled lab versus out in the field.
Right. It's that classic tension between control and authenticity. Lab experiments, you can isolate variables, keep things neat and tidy, but they can feel kind of artificial. Then field experiments, you've got the messiness of the real world, which is more authentic, but is way harder to control for all the stuff that could be affecting the results.
And of course, researchers have steps that they take to deal with those challenges when they're designing a field experiment.
Okay.
It's not as simple as just setting up shop in a park and seeing what happens.
So let's talk about those steps. What's the first thing a researcher needs to do when they're planning a field experiment?
Well, like with any research study, the first step is really identifying the problem.
Okay.
What are you hoping to learn? What variables are you interested in studying?
Right.
And maybe most importantly, how are you going to define and measure those variables in a way that makes sense in the real world?
So you got to have a clear research question, make sure you're measuring the right things.
Exactly. And then comes the tricky part, sampling. Even in a field experiment, you can't always study every single person.
Right.
You got to pick a representative sample. That's going to let you generalize your findings.
Right. You can't study every fifth grader in the country, so you got to choose a group that's like a snapshot of the whole population.
That's exactly it. But that can be tricky.
Yeah. How do you make sure you have a representative sample when you're dealing with the complexities of the real world?
It's a challenge for sure. Researchers have to really think about the demographics, the characteristics, and potential biases within that population.
Right.
They might use different techniques like, random sampling or stratified sampling to try to make sure that their sample is as diverse and representative as possible.
So it's not just grabbing any group of fifth graders.
Right.
It's about thoughtfully picking participants that reflect the bigger population.
Precisely. What's next?
What's the next step?
The third step is developing the research plan.
Okay.
And this is where the experimental design really comes together. This is like the blueprint for your experiment.
Right.
It outlines how you're going to manipulate the independent variable.
Okay.
That's the thing you're changing, while trying to control for all those other variables as much as you can.
So you're basically creating a roadmap for the experiment, trying to anticipate any problems and plan for them.
Exactly. And in this plan, you got to figure out how you're going to measure the dependent variable.
Okay.
That's the outcome you're interested in.
Right.
So what data are you collecting? How are you going to collect it? And what statistical analysis are you going to use to figure out what it all means?
So it's about having a clear plan for how you're going to gather and analyze the data to answer your research question.
Exactly. There's definitely a lot of thought that goes into it beforehand.
It sounds like it. But I guess that careful planning is really important to make sure the study is done right.
Absolutely. It's all about making sure your findings are valid.
Okay. Research question, check. Representative sample, check. Detailed research plan, check. Now what?
The fourth step is picking the right data collection tools. Are you going to use surveys, observations, interviews, some combination?
Right.
Yeah.
Even within a field experiment, you still have choices to make about how you gather information.
Exactly. Each one has its pros and cons.
Yeah.
And the best choice really depends on your research question.
Right.
And the specific situation of your field experiment.
And those choices are going to affect the kind of data you get, right?
Of course. Picking the right tools is crucial for making sure you have good quality, relevant data.
Okay, so you've got your plan, you've got your tools. What's next?
Well, then it's time to actually put that plan into action.
Right. Step number 5, procedure.
Yep. This is where you're getting all the permissions you need, recruiting participants, and actually running the experiment out in the field.
I bet this is where things can get a little crazy, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because you're dealing with real people in the real world.
Absolutely. Flexibility and adaptability are key for any field experimenter.
So it's not just about following a script. You got to be able to think on your feet and roll with the punches.
Exactly. You got to be ready to change your plans as needed,
right?
Troubleshoot problems, and sometimes even totally rethink your approach if things aren't working.
So it's more about being responsive to the environment.
Yeah, and that's what makes field experiments so challenging, but also so rewarding.
Right.
Because you're constantly learning and adapting.
Yeah.
And the insights you get are often a lot richer than what you would get in a more controlled setting.
Okay, so you've made it through data collection out in the wild. What's the final step?
The sixth and final step is analyzing that data you collected.
Right, because even if you see a difference between the groups, you got to make sure it's actually meaningful.
Right, exactly. And that's where those statistical tests come in.
Right.
They help researchers figure out the probability that the results they're seeing are actually because of what they changed.
Right.
And not just because of random chance.
Okay, so you've analyzed the data.
Yeah.
Determine if your findings are statistically significant. Do you just write up your report and call it a day?
Well, writing up the report is definitely important.
Right.
But it's not the end.
Okay.
Remember, field experiments are often done to solve real problems.
Yeah.
So the goal is to use those findings to actually make a difference.
So it's about taking those research findings and using them to inform, like, practice, policy, or even just our own understanding of the world.
Precisely. Field experiments can be a really powerful tool for making a difference, but only if we actually take the time to understand what the findings mean and how we can use them in practical ways.
Well, our exploration of field experiments has been really eye-opening. It's definitely clear that studying human behavior out in the real world is tough, but it's super valuable.
It is.
But speaking of valuable endeavors, I'm looking at the clock, and I think we've reached the end of part 2 of our deep dive.
Seems like we've come to the end of another chapter in our research methods journey.
But don't worry, everyone. Our exploration isn't over yet. Join us for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll keep uncovering all these amazing ways we learn and understand the world around us.
All right, welcome back to our final part of this research methods deep dive.
Why?
I feel like we've been on this crazy journey, exploring all these different ways we figure things out, and try to make sense of the world.
It's been quite the adventure.
It has been.
We started with surveys, remember?
I know, right?
Then we went back in time with that ex post facto research. We even dealt with those wild field experiments.
I know.
I think we've all become way more critical thinkers about information now.
Sure. Speaking of being critical, you mentioned before how some folks see case studies as, I don't know, less serious than other research methods.
Yeah.
I'll admit, I kind of used to think that way too.
Yeah.
But after all this, I'm seeing them totally differently. It's a pretty common misconception.
Yeah.
But once you understand what case studies are for and how powerful they can be, it's easy to see why that's not really true.
Yeah.
Remember, it's not always about applying the findings to everyone.
Right.
Sometimes the best insights come from really digging into that one unique case.
It's like that saying, the exception proves the rule, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes it's those weird cases, the ones that don't fit the pattern.
Right.
Those are the ones that teach us the most. They make us question what we think we know.
Yeah, they force you to think outside the box.
Right.
And in the end, you get a much deeper understanding.
The source, UNIT-4.pdf, actually had a good example of this.
Oh, right.
They talked about how case studies can be used to test the limits of theories.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Which I thought really showed this idea.
It's like, remember that analogy? Stress testing a bridge.
Oh, yeah. You're
not trying to break it.
Right.
But you are trying to see how much it can handle.
By pushing those boundaries, by looking at the cases that don't fit.
Right.
That's how we can improve our theories and get a more accurate view of things.
Exactly. It's not about ignoring those weird cases.
Right.
It's about using them as opportunities to learn and grow.
One thing that really struck me during this whole deep dive was how important it is to connect research to the real world.
Oh, absolutely.
So not enough to just gather information and analyze it.
Right.
We got to know how to use that knowledge to make a real difference.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's one of the coolest things about case studies.
Yeah.
They can directly affect things like, how we do things, what policies we make, even how we understand ourselves.
Exactly. We talked about how they can be used for professional development, making decisions, even in fields like law and medicine.
Yeah.
They're not just some abstract thing.
Right.
They're tools for solving real problems.
And UNIT-4.pdf actually gives some specific examples. One that I thought was interesting was about program evaluation.
Yeah, I remember that.
They talked about how you can use case studies to see if a program is actually working or to figure out how to make it better.
Right.
And to understand why it succeeds or fails.
So instead of just relying on numbers.
Yeah, like test scores or attendance.
Right.
Case studies let you get a much deeper understanding of how a program is really affecting people.
It's about going beyond the statistics and seeing the human side of things.
Exactly. And that kind of understanding is super important.
Yeah.
For making good decisions about how to design, run, and improve programs.
It's like the difference between reading a restaurant review that just gives you a star rating versus actually going there and eating the food.
Exactly.
You get a much more complete experience.
You get the whole picture.
And that highlights why it's so important to use different methods when you're evaluating something.
Absolutely.
Numbers can give you a general idea, but the qualitative stuff, like what you get from case studies, that helps you understand why those numbers are what they are. This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener. It wasn't just about learning a bunch of terms.
Right.
It was about developing a whole new way of thinking.
Yeah, becoming a more critical thinker.
Approaching the world with curiosity and a bit of healthy skepticism.
Well said. I think that's a perfect way to wrap things up.
Yeah.
To all our listeners out there.
Yeah.
Remember, research is powerful,
Mm-hmm.
but it's only as good as our ability to understand it.
Right.
To question it, and most importantly, to use it in our own lives.
Yes.
And to make the world a better place.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So everyone, stay curious.
Here.
Keep asking those questions.
Keep learning.
And never stop exploring this amazing world of research and discovery. That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Your support helps us keep creating valuable content like this. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Join our community for more insights into psychology and personal development. Let's grow and learn together. See you in the next video.